Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to take a look at another one of my games from the recently finished 17th North American FIDE Invitational, played in Chicago, Illinois. This was my game from the next to last round. This is played one game before the game with Tate that I showed you guys a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to get to my last round game, but there's just a lot in it, and I'm not really ready in terms of my analysis yet to present everything that's in it. So I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm just still trying to figure things out for myself without switching on Fritz or Ribka or any of those guys to help me out. So we'll take a look right now at my game against Stamnov. So another repeat opponent from previous shows. And once again, I had black. So let me flip the board around here for you. So this is, again, played in round 7. I needed to basically win out at this point to have my IM norm, and I did win this game. Okay, so Stamnov played e4, I played e5, and you might remember that the previous time I played him, I had prepared for nothing but the Scotch, and was really just shocked when he played d4, since all the games I had seen of his in the database had him playing the Scotch with white against e4, e5. But this time, he stuck to Old Faithful here and played knight f3. So, okay, my preparation this time was right. Of course, I did prepare for the center game some more before this encounter as well. Alright, so knight c6, d4, takes, bishop c5, knight c6. This is what he generally played. Bishop to e3 is, of course, another very important move, and you can't play the bishop to c5 Scotch without knowing that line as well. Okay, so queen f6, and here there are a number of things that white can play, but basically there are two real branches at this point. There's queen f3, which Stamnov played, but there's also queen to d2, and this is another very important variation, and good luck with the analysis. If that comes up in another one of my games, well, you may get to see that. Alright, so queen f3 is what he played. Here, b takes c6 is the right capture. There are a lot of lines in the Scotch where black should play d takes c6, but this isn't one of them. So here, in part because the b file can be quite useful, and also because d5 is often a good equalizing thrust as well. In this case, b takes c6 is indicated. But you have to be a little bit careful with these structures. I mean, there's something to be said for each of these, at least in the abstract. So when you play d takes c6, the danger with this kind of structure, and I believe it's relevant in this particular variation, is that you end up with the same problem that you end up with in the exchange Ruy-Lopez, except here white doesn't even have to give up the bishop here. So the problem with this kind of structure for black is that these four pawns are going to be unable to create a passed pawn on the queen side, while white's clean majority over here, this 4 and 3 on the king side, can result in a passed pawn. So this might seem trivial, but in fact, okay, the endgame is far away, that's true, but many games have been won with this kind of strategy over the years, and again, I would suggest looking up exchange Ruy-Lopez games. I believe Fischer actually utilized this strategy in two particular games at least. One in an exchange Ruy, but he also beat Gideon Barza, B-A-R-C-Z-A, in a Caro-Kann with e takes f6, and so there it was kind of the reverse. He had a clean queenside majority, Barza had a kingside majority that was crippled slightly with the doubled f pawns, and Fischer went on to win using that imbalance. So you might want to take a look at that somewhere. But common idea. On the other hand, when black plays b takes c6, the problem is that this queenside structure can be a little bit disgusting as well. And so while black is able to fight for the center quite adequately, there can be troubles with this queenside structure. But here, really, it's pretty well shielded. It's not so easy for white to get at. And that won't be a factor anytime soon, but that's just a possibility for down the road. So it's not something for nothing for black either way. Okay, so anyway, here my opponent surprised me a bit. The two main moves in this position are queen to g3, keeping the queens on, obviously, and hitting c7, though taking there is an iffy proposition, and also putting some pressure on the g7 pawn and maybe preparing bishop to g5 in some lines. while also clearing the way for the f-pawn to advance to. So it's just an aggressive try. The other main try here is knight to d2. Ironically, the point of knight to d2 isn't to recapture with the knight if black takes. Queen takes f3, g takes f3 is actually standard operating procedure there. And white can follow up with knight to b3. So I'll show this. So if this capture occurs, white can follow up with knight to b3, bishop to e3, and so on. And it turns out that this kingside structure of white, even though it's got a doubled pawn now, is really still okay. White still has reasonable chances of utilizing it in a good way. The g file is available and can have promise. And the doubled f pawns are actually quite good. So the f3 pawn strengthens the pawn on e4, while the pawn on f2 allows bishop to e3. And if black makes the exchange there, again, those two, the doubled e pawns then, can prove valuable as well. All right. So at any rate, I have prepared for those moves. While knight c3, when I got to this position during the game, I was, I try to remember what it was that I was supposed to play here. I just didn't remember, and it turned out that's because I hadn't prepared for it, because knight to c3 was, I don't think it was a novelty. Let me check the opening book here. Yeah, it's not a novelty, but it's far, far more rare than knight to d2 certainly, and a little bit more rare than queen to g3. And it also doesn't perform well for white at all. So it's simply not really the most testing move. Now, in this position, black usually plays queen takes f3, and I think d6 is actually also a standard move. But the move I played, I think, is okay. I played bishop to d4, and this is done fine in the databases too, though not based on many games. And in fact, bishop to d4 is a pretty common reaction in quite a number of Scotch lines when white does play knight to c3 in these queen f6, queen f3 kinds of systems. So if I had this to do again, I would probably play d6 the next time, but I think bishop to d4 is fundamentally okay as well. All right, he played bishop to d2. Now I played d6. He played bishop to e2, a little bit passive, and now I played rook to b8. So I wanted to either induce a weakness or make him commit to one side or the other to castle. None of this, I'm not going to let him stay flexible forever with his king. Alright, so here he played b3. And, okay, it's not forced, he could castle, but probably b3 is okay. It's a tolerable move. Alright, and now I thought of kind of an interesting idea. And it served as a bit of a temptation for him as well, and one that he succumbed to. Although, to be honest, his succumbing to the temptation wasn't such a bad thing. Anyway, what I played was bishop to g4, and this is kind of a fun move. It's a way of developing quickly. And here, you should ask, or you might want to ask, what you would do with this move if you had white. Honestly, I think both responses are okay, but as a matter of preference, it's kind of good for you to figure out what kind of player you are here. Okay, well, what I think is probably best here, at least on one level, is queen takes f6, knight takes f6, and now f3. And then after bishop to e6, simply to castle long. And I believe this position is approximately equal. My doubled c-pawns are not really a problem. In fact, I can even consider playing c5, c4 in some positions to liquidate them or to open some lines on the queen side. So I really don't believe I have any serious problems here. I should avoid, though, instead of bishop to e6, I should not play bishop to h5. The bishop is really not going to be so good there. And although it seems to set a little bit of a trap, it in fact doesn't. So it might look as if I prevented castling queenside with this because of bishop c3 and then knight takes e4. And now bishop takes g7 wouldn't be very good. If white were to take here, black simply plays rook to g8, and I'm not only threatening this and threatening knight to f2, but I'm also threatening simply to capture on g2, and between all of this, I think black is doing quite well. However, white grabs the knight, and then after bishop takes e2, plays rook to d2, which is a good move. And now after the bishop moves somewhere, white plays bishop takes g7, and I believe that white has some advantage here. It's not tremendous, but all of my pawns then turn out to be kind of bad. I'll have isolated pawns on the king side. My a pawn is isolated, and let's say white plays something like e5 at some moment. Then if I play d5, then I'm basically begging him to blockade on the dark squares. So bishop goes to d4 or c5, and I have some small problems there. While his only weak pawn is the e4 pawn, which he can probably trade off or at least have very securely protected when it goes to e5. So this would be a bit better for white. All right, so the right response, as I said, is bishop e6, castles with approximate equality. But my opponent decided to play more sharply with queen takes g4. I played bishop takes c3, rook to d1, takes, and so I had calculated all of this out. Check here, knight f6, queen g7, rook g8, queen h6. And, okay, to continue what I had calculated, so I looked at all of this. Knight e4, rook e2, queen c3 check, king f1, queen d4. So this is what I had calculated before I played bishop to g4, and I even saw queen c1 and thought, okay, I'm in good shape here. And I took all this to be more or less forced when I first thought about it when playing bishop to g4. But it turns out, I mean, there are a couple of alternatives along the way, which I saw as the game was going on, and a couple that I missed. Okay, so going back to this position, I think rook takes g2 is even better. And I'm not sure that I have an advantage in this position, but it's pretty close, and I would say the position is fairly dangerous now for white. So I think this capture would have been a bit better. And after knight takes e4, here white should probably play queen takes h7. And in this position, maybe I actually am a little bit worse. Moves to consider here, rook to g6, although I think this move isn't quite so good. And the better move is king to f8, but here too, white is a little bit better. So here I would have been caught off a little bit. On the other hand, again, I could have played rook takes g2 before that. But what's interesting is that at the end of my main line, queen to d4, I had just assumed that queen to c1 was forced, and this is what Stamnov played. But in fact, white has two alternative possibilities. See if you can figure out what they are. Okay, well, one of them is queen. Well, actually, they're both really kind of startling. So one is just king to e1, and it's not, at least immediately evident, that I have anything better than repeating the position. I could probably find something to play on, but maybe my best move is just queen c3 and then queen back to d4 again. The other alternative, I'm probably doing okay after it, but it's still kind of shocking, is simply queen takes h7, with the point that after queen takes d1 check, rook to e1, well, knight to d2 would be mating, except that it's illegal. It puts my own king in check. And meanwhile, I've got no way to protect the queen and the rook, except for playing queen to g4. But now, of course, rook takes e4 would just be absolutely devastating and crushing, and I can resign. So queen takes h7 is actually quite a fascinating possibility, and one you might want to explore, along with the other little alternatives I mentioned along the way. All right, well, let's go back to the game, though. Queen to c1 was played, and here I played king to d7. So it's very important that I have the time to do that, which is why I needed this little queen c3 check business. If I play queen to d4 here, there's no threat. So you can simply play queen takes h7, or more simply just f3, and I'm probably toast here, or at least I have to fish around. Maybe there's something, I don't know, but it's dubious at best. But I'd seen queen c3 check first, and now queen to d4. So with tempo I protect my knight, and that gives me time now to get my king off of the e-file and save my knight. And now I felt, this is more or less what I had expected beforehand, and I thought I was in very good shape here. I mean, his king is a little bit stupid, his rook on h1 is not developed, the bishop on d1 is rather amusingly posted, to put it mildly. I've got more space, my rook is on the g-file, looks good there. The other rook is ready to come into the game, either somewhere on the king side. Maybe I'll double on the g file, maybe I'll put it on the e file. And there's also the possibility of lifting it up and over too. So lots of possibilities. The rook could go to g5, f5, e5, maybe even d5, who knows. So I felt pretty comfortable about this position. But it turns out that it's not quite so easy. It's still very much a game. Stamnov played c4, and this does a few things. One is that it clears the path for the bishop to come to c2, which isn't so bad. It gets it right back into the game. And then from there, it might even come to f5 and maybe even bother my king a little bit. Secondly, he's of course preventing this rook lift, so that's no longer going to happen. So c4 isn't so bad. And here I thought for a while. Let me see if I can find out how long I thought. Have my game scores handy. Yeah, I thought for 10 minutes. Okay, so took a little time. And one of the things that I really wanted to make work was rook takes g2. So I thought this would be delightful if I can get this to work, but it doesn't quite. So king takes, rook to g8, king f1, and now, all right, if I try to double on the g file, simply f3 covers everything. On the other hand, if I play queen to d3, which stops f3 and threatens queen to h3 check, or maybe queen to f3, yeah, queen to f3 was the idea. And then on rook to g1, then queen to h3 check wins everything. Unfortunately, he just plays king to e1 preemptively, and on queen f3, now the rook has f1 as a flight square, and I've got nothing. So, couldn't find any way to make rook takes g2 work, and the computer hasn't found anything either when I checked it. So I ended up switching gears and played rook b to e8, which I think is the right move. So my knight's better protected, my rook is maybe able to come into the game in this way, and I'm also allowing my king to castle by hand, so I want to get it to c8 if need be. Okay, well here he played bishop to c2, which is again a decent move. Now if I play king to c8, I think he can just play g3, and he's starting to consolidate. I mean, he's ready to play king to g2, and then bring the rook into play to e1 or d1, and my initiative is really dissipating in that situation. I'd probably still have an okay game. I mean, I've got a lot of space, and my pieces are all well posted, but I also have a lot of bad pawns too. So it's a structure versus initiative battle, and I don't want to be too slow about this. So I play knight to c3. I want to trade off his active rook, and I see that he can play bishop to f5 check, but it's not such a big deal. King d8, takes, and now though he can play g3, and so here I think I'm only still a little bit better. I'm not really, I don't have a knockout blow in this position. I mean, if I play rook to e2, the problem with that is that he has queen to g5 check. So rook to e2, queen g5, could play queen f4 if he had to, but this is just better. And all of a sudden the game is kind of murky. It's not so clear. So I think I'm a little bit better here, but because this bishop is just so good, and my king's position is just a little bit messed up, it's a good hard battle at this point. So you also could have played rook takes e8. This would just transpose, takes, bishop f5, king d8, and g3. All right, so here I was fortunate that he played the move rook to d2. And I'm not really sure why he did this. I think this just gives me extra options really for free. So I played queen to g4 with an obvious threat. And here I would again suggest that you take some time and try to figure out what white to move ought to do in this position. Alright, well the threat is quite clear. I'm threatening to capture on g2, and in fact that would be checkmate in one move. Here Stamnov made my life very easy and played g3, which just loses straight away. Queen h3 check, king g1, knight e2 check, and here he resigned. And reasonably so, because after rook takes e2, rook takes e2, he's in serious trouble, obviously. Not only is he down material, not only is his rook still ridiculous on h1, but I'm also threatening to win on the spot with rook g to e8 and then play rook to e1. So bishop to d3 is more or less forced. And then after rook takes a2, he has almost a trick with queen to b1. hitting the rook, and even more importantly, threatening bishop to f5 check, winning my queen. Unfortunately for him, I can simply play rook to a5 when I'm up the exchange and a pawn, and can double rooks on the e-file with mayhem to ensue. So this is an easy win, and so after knight to e2 check, he resigned. But he could have put up much more resistance, and the other two ways of defending the g pawn, pardon me, are both worth considering. So for instance, f3, this isn't so bad. Here I should play queen to g5, so trying to keep his rook pinned, and also with the rather nasty idea of playing rook to e2 or knight to e2, which will interfere with the rook's defense of g2, and then I can hopefully take on that square. So g3 is probably right, and now even so, rook to e2 is a good move. Okay, white can play f4, and now queen to h5, threatening quick mate with queen to f3 and then queen g2. But white still has a couple of tricks up his sleeve here with bishop to f5 check. So that covers h3, and if I just move my king, he can play, I believe, queen takes c3 as well, and then the queen covers f3, the bishop covers h3, and of course I can take his bishop, but then my rook's hanging, or if I trade rooks and take the bishop, he's consolidated. So the right move here is just to take, naturally. Rook takes e2 is best, queen h3 check, king f2, takes, queen g2 check, king's got to come up, rook e8, and white should just surrender the h-pawn to exchange the rooks, or at least to prevent my rook from penetrating, prevent things like queen to e2 check followed by rook to e3 from occurring. But here I can just grab material and grab the one pawn. I'm threatening the b3 pawn, I'm threatening the h2 pawn, and so in this position black is winning. Of course there will be some technical difficulties because the poor pawn structure and my king is slightly exposed, but black should win this. So f3, going back to here, is a reasonable try, but it looks as if there are just too many gaps in white's structure, and he won't be able to hold on. Okay, rook to g1 though is much more interesting and tricky, because now I'd still like to put a piece on e2. I mean, it looks very natural and like it should be very strong. But as it turns out, they're both knight to e2 and rook to e2 are serious mistakes. If knight to e2, queen to d1, and the threat of f3 is quite serious. Also, if I take on g1 here, then he has takes, bishop f5 check, king d8, bishop g4, and the problem is that my knight is stuck. Material's equal, and he can't take it right away because of rook to e1 mate, but all he has to do is just push the h-pawn, the g-pawn, whatever, play rook to d1, and my knight vanishes, so of course I'm losing here. Likewise, though not quite as severe, if I play rook to e2, I get pinned once again, this time with the bishop. Now, I can wriggle with queen to f4, threatening mate on f2, and then after bishop takes e2, play knight to e4. So I've got queen takes f2 mate as a threat, and I'm threatening to grab the rook. Unfortunately, white has this trick, rook takes d6 check, and this discovers an attack on my queen. So I have to retreat with my queen to recapture, and then here, white is clearly better. My pawns are just disgusting, and the mating possibilities really are gone. I mean, he can play g3, if nothing else. Maybe bishop to f3 is good. But g3 looks, at least at first sight, like the most natural move here. So it protects the h-pawn, it cuts off the f4 square, and it prepares king to g2, followed by bringing the rook into play. And I'm basically a pawn down for virtually nothing. Alright, so after rook to g1, knight to e2 is no good, and rook to e2 is no good. However, rook to e5 would be very strong. And I'm simply, well, I'm threatening maybe in some cases to move the rook sideways, but really the big idea is to just double on the e-file and exploit that advantage. So h3, for instance, queen to h5, bishop d1, We swap, and now rook g to e8. And of course white can't capture on h5. Well, he can, but he'll be sorry. They give checkmate in one move. But even after the better f4, I can swap queens and play rook to e2. And again, this really bad rook of his, locked in by his own king, is just a constant asset for black here. It's stuck out of the game, and okay, I'm threatening the a-pawn. If he were to play something like rook to a1, I can play, I don't know, rook to b2, rook c2, I'm not sure it matters. It'll probably come to the same thing. So let's say rook to d2 even. It really doesn't want to allow me to double on the second rank, so rook to e1 is maybe semi-forced, but then takes, rook a2. Yeah, actually you can't do this because not only have I won the pawn, but there's no way for him to avoid the exchange of rooks, after which the endgame is, the king and pawn ending is easily won for black, despite the doubled pawns on the queen side. So if you can't play rook to e1, then life is pretty bad. I mean, I don't know what he's going to do. You know, if he pushes the a pawn, then the b pawn is going to be under attack, and his king is under attack, and yeah, this is just horrible. And actually, rook to b2 would be better. So let's do that. Anyway, same idea, and white's toast. So g3, as played by Stamnov, made life easier, but it looks to me that he's losing in any case, and so really rook to d2 was the decisive error. But even in a position like this, I mean, it's just it's a tough position to play. I mean, there are so many things wrong with his position that it's almost miraculous that he's able to make the game interesting in this line with bishop f5, takes and takes, because of this little snap counterattack that he's got. So an interesting game, very lively. It was a very quick game. I think recording this show is almost as is taking almost as long as the game did for us. Not quite, but not too far from it either. But it was, as I said, kind of a lively and fun game, and I like the calculation that I made back here. So even though bishop to g4 is in its own way just kind of a natural developing move, I had to analyze quite a bit to make sure that everything worked out in these lines. So a very entertaining game, and one that definitely energized me. So before this, I mean, I had won the two games before this one, but you know, I didn't feel fully satisfied with either of them, and they were both against relatively lower rated players. Whereas this one was against, okay, I'm higher rated than Stamnov as well, but he's a player who's, you know, more or less a peer. I mean, his rating is not too far from my own, and so to win this game and win it in kind of nice fashion really energized me. And so by the time I played the game with Tate, I was in a pretty good mood, and that of course didn't hurt my mood either. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Hope maybe you learned a little something, or at least had some fun practicing your tactical skills. And next time, I believe for the Christmas break, I'll try to have the Tate game, not the Tate game, the Antonio game prepared by then. So that's a very rich game, and because it's such a rich game, I mean, I really want to do it right for myself before I switch on the engine to check my own analysis, and I think you'll enjoy it more as a result as well. So thanks everyone, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and I'll talk to you next week. Goodbye.